Cedar Valley, Iowa, October 12, 1978. The smell of wet earth and fallen leaves hung heavy in the morning air as Robert Bobby Hartwell pulled on his work boots at 5:47 a.m. The 34-year-old corn farmer had followed this same routine for over a decade, coffee black, boots laced tight, and out to check the north field before the sun crested the horizon. His wife Sarah was still asleep upstairs, and their 2 young daughters wouldn't wake for another hour. Bobby's 240-acre farm sat on the edge of Cedar Valley, where rolling hills met endless rows of corn that stretched toward the Iowa sky. October meant harvest time, and the Deere combine had been running almost non-stop for 2 weeks. The weather forecast called for rain by evening, so every hour of daylight mattered. The kitchen radio crackled with news of the ongoing energy crisis and something about a new movie called Halloween hitting theaters. Bobby clicked it off, grabbed his thermos and stepped into the crisp autumn morning. Frost sparkled on the pickup truck's windshield, and his breath formed small clouds as he walked across the gravel driveway. "Gonna be a long day," he muttered to himself, a habit he'd developed during the solitary hours of farm work. His neighbor, Earl Kowalski, was already moving cattle in the adjacent pasture. The 2 men exchanged their usual wave, a simple gesture that had marked countless mornings over the years. Bobby climbed into his Ford F-150, the engine turning over with a familiar rumble that echoed across the quiet valley. The north field was a 20-minute drive along narrow county roads lined with oak and maple trees painted in brilliant oranges and reds. Bobby knew every pothole, every curve, every mailbox along the way. This was his land, his life, his legacy he was building for his daughters. He parked near the field's edge and walked the perimeter, checking moisture levels in the soil and examining the corn stalks for signs of damage from the previous night's wind. Everything looked good. The harvest would continue on schedule. By 7:15 a.m., Bobby was back in his truck, ready to return home for breakfast with his family. Sarah would have pancakes waiting, and little Amy would insist on putting way too much syrup on hers, while 6-year-old Jessica helped pour orange juice. But Bobby Hartwell never made it home that morning. When Sarah called Earl Kowalski at 9:30 a.m., asking if he'd seen Bobby, neither of them was particularly worried. Farm equipment broke down, trucks got stuck, and a dozen small emergencies could delay a farmer's return. But as the hours passed and Bobby's CB radio remained silent, worry crept into Sarah's voice. By noon, Earl was driving the back roads, looking for any sign of the missing Ford pickup. By 2 p.m., the Cedar Valley Sheriff's Department had been called. By sunset, the entire farming community was searching. Bobby's truck was found at 11:47 p.m., parked exactly where he'd left it that morning near the north field. The keys were still in the ignition. His thermos sat half empty on the dashboard, and his work gloves lay on the passenger seat. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no disturbance in the surrounding area. Robert Hartwell had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind a family that would spend the next 45 years searching for answers in a case that would become Cedar Valley's most enduring mystery. Cedar Valley, Iowa, October 1978 to December 1982. The search for Bobby Hartwell consumed Cedar Valley like nothing anyone could remember. Within 48 hours, over 200 volunteers had combed every inch of the surrounding farmland, checked abandoned barns, and walked the banks of Miller Creek for miles in both directions. The Iowa State Patrol brought in helicopters, and bloodhounds from Des Moines traced Bobby's scent from his truck to the edge of the cornfield before losing the trail completely. Sarah Hartwell aged years in those first few weeks. Friends and neighbors took turns staying with her and the girls, bringing casseroles and offering shoulders to cry on. But as October turned to November, and November faded into a harsh Iowa winter, the daily visits became weekly phone calls, and eventually even those grew less frequent. "People want to help," Sarah confided to her sister Margaret during one of their late-night conversations. "But what can they do? Bobby's just gone." The investigation, led by Sheriff Tom Branson, revealed few concrete leads. Bobby had no known enemies, no financial troubles, and no history of mental health issues. His marriage was solid, his farm was profitable, and he was deeply involved in his daughters' lives. The theory that he'd simply walked away from his responsibilities seemed impossible to anyone who knew him. Detective Ray Morrison, brought in from the State Bureau, spent months interviewing everyone in Bobby's life. The John Deere dealership where Bobby bought parts, the grain elevator where he sold his corn, his high school friends, his church congregation, even his daughter's teachers. Every conversation painted the same picture. Bobby Hartwell was a devoted family man who lived for his farm and his girls. He was planning to expand the operation, explained Bill Henderson, Bobby's banker. Had already put down a deposit on 40 more acres. Man doesn't do that if he's planning to disappear. But as 1978 turned to 1979, the active investigation quietly wound down. Sheriff Branson kept the case open, but with no new evidence and no witnesses, there was little more the department could do. Bobby's missing person file joined dozens of others in the county's cold case storage. Sarah struggled to keep the farm running. Earl Kowalski and other neighbors helped with the heavy work, but the financial pressure was overwhelming. Bobby's life insurance company refused to pay out without a death certificate, and you couldn't get a death certificate without a body. The bank extended her loan payments, but their patience had limits. By 1980, Sarah had sold 120 acres to pay down debts. By 1982, she'd moved the girls into town and taken a job at the Cedar Valley Elementary School. The remaining farmland was leased to Earl D., who maintained it with the same care Bobby would have shown. Amy and Jessica grew up with the weight of their father's disappearance, shaping every milestone. Birthday parties felt incomplete. Christmas mornings carried an undertone of sadness. High school graduations were bittersweet celebrations where one chair always sat conspicuously empty. The community never forgot, but they learned to live with the mystery. Bobby's name came up at church socials and high school reunions, usually followed by the same questions. Whatever happened to Bobby Hartwell? And, think we'll ever know what really happened out there? Local teenagers, drawn by the mystery, would sometimes dare each other to walk through the North Field at night. Stories grew and evolved. Some claimed to see Bobby's ghost walking the corn rows. Others insisted his truck still appeared there on foggy mornings. Sarah hated these tales, but she couldn't stop them. Detective Morrison retired in 1985, but he never stopped thinking about the case. Every few months, he'd drive out to the field where Bobby's truck had been found, stand in the exact spot, and try to imagine what had happened that morning. The corn grew and was harvested, seasons changed, technology advanced, but the land kept its secrets. "I'm 40 years in law enforcement," Morrison told his replacement, "and Bobby Hartwell is the one that got away. Everything about that case felt wrong from day one, but I could never put my finger on what we were missing." As the years passed, Cedar Valley changed. Family farms gave way to corporate agriculture. Young people moved to larger cities for opportunities their grandparents never could have imagined. But Bobby's disappearance remained a touchstone for the community, a reminder that some questions might never be answered and some wounds might never fully heal. Sarah never remarried. She kept Bobby's wedding ring in a jewelry box on her dresser and his favorite coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet, just in case he ever came home. Cedar Valley, Iowa, 1985 to 2010. Detective Ray Morrison couldn't let the Hartwell case go, even after his official retirement in 1985. The missing farmer had become his white whale, the one case that refused to make sense no matter how many times he reviewed the evidence. "There's something we missed," Morrison told his wife Eleanor over dinner one evening in 1987. "Bobby didn't just vanish into thin air. Someone knows what happened, and they're keeping quiet about it." Morrison had developed his own theories over the years. The location where Bobby's truck was found bothered him most. The North Field was isolated, yes, but it was also visible from Earl Kowalski's property. If someone had taken Bobby from that spot, they would have needed to know Earl's daily routine to avoid being seen. In 1992, Morrison convinced Sheriff Branson to let him re-interview everyone involved in the original case. Most people were willing to talk, but Morrison noticed something disturbing. Earl Kowalski's story had changed slightly over the years. Small details, nothing dramatic, but inconsistencies that hadn't been there in 1978. Earl said he saw Bobby drive past his house that morning around 6:45, Morrison noted in his personal case file, but in 1978 he said it was closer to 7. Why would he remember it differently now? Morrison also discovered something the original investigation had missed. Earl Kowalski had serious financial problems in 1978. His farm was heavily mortgaged, and he'd borrowed money from several sources to keep operating. The detective found records of Earl making large cash deposits in late 1978 and early 1979, deposits that seemed inconsistent with his farm's income. Where was Earl getting cash money during the worst farming economy in decades? Morrison wondered. The retired detective spent his own money hiring a private investigator to track down Vincent Torres, a name that had appeared in peripheral reports about suspicious activity in the area during 1978. Torres had worked briefly for a farm equipment dealer and had been questioned about some missing machinery, Garvey, but nothing had been proven. What Morrison discovered about Torres was troubling. The man had connections to a multi-state farm equipment theft ring that had been operating throughout the Midwest in the late 1970s. Police had suspected the ring was using legitimate farms as temporary storage facilities, but they'd never been able to prove it. In 1995, Morrison received an anonymous letter postmarked from Kansas City. It contained just one sentence. Earl Kowalski knows more than he's saying about Bobby Hartwell. Morrison showed the letter to Sheriff Branson, but without more concrete evidence, there was little they could do. Accusations based on anonymous tips rarely led to convictions, especially in cases that were nearly 2 decades old. The breakthrough Morrison had been waiting for came in 1998, when the FBI arrested several members of the Midwest farm equipment theft ring during a sting operation in Nebraska. During questioning, one of the suspects mentioned hearing stories about a farmer in Iowa who had been eliminated because he'd discovered their operation. The guy said it happened somewhere around Cedar Valley. FBI agent Patricia Hayes told Morrison during a phone call, said it was back in the 70s, and that they'd made the problem disappear permanently. When I pressed for details, he clammed up and demanded a lawyer. Morrison was 73 years old by then, but the phone call energized him like nothing had in years. He drove to Nebraska to meet with Agent Hayes and review the FBI's files on the theft ring. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions about Bobby Hartwell's disappearance. The theft ring had operated for nearly 15 years, stealing millions of dollars worth of farm equipment. They used a network of corrupt farmers who would provide storage and transportation in exchange for cash payments. Farmers who discovered the operation and refused to cooperate were typically intimidated into silence, but according to the FBI's informants, there had been one case where intimidation hadn't worked. A farmer in Iowa had stumbled onto the operation and threatened to report it to authorities. That farmer had been killed, and his body had been hidden so effectively that it was never found. The timeline matches perfectly, Morrison told Sheriff Torres when she took office in 2003. Bobby disappeared in October 1978, right when this theft ring was most active in our area. Earl Kowalski had financial troubles that mysteriously resolved themselves around the same time, and we have FBI informants saying someone was killed in Cedar Valley. Sheriff Torres, who had grown up hearing stories about the Hartwell case, was intrigued but cautious. Ray, we've been down this road before. Theories don't convict people. We need hard evidence, and after 25 years, I'm not sure we're going to find any. Morrison continued his investigation until his death in 2011, but he never found the concrete proof he needed to reopen the case officially. His grandson Jake inherited boxes of files, photographs, and notes that represented decades of obsessive detective work. Grandpa never stopped believing he could solve it, Jake told his friends. He used to say that the truth always finds a way to surface, even if it takes 50 years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, that Jake Morrison would eventually be the one to literally unearth the truth his grandfather had spent his lifetime seeking. Cedar Valley, Iowa, March 15, 2023. The backhoe's bucket scraped against something that definitely wasn't limestone. Jake Morrison, Detective Ray Morrison's grandson, cut the engine and climbed down from the cab to investigate. He was excavating the foundation for a new grain storage facility on what used to be the Hartwell property, now owned by Agritech Consolidated. The object protruding from the soil looked like fabric, but it was partially encased in what appeared to be concrete or plaster. Jake had heard his grandfather's stories about Bobby Hartwell dozens of times over the years, and something about this discovery made his skin crawl. "Hey, Mr. Patterson," Jake called to the construction foreman. "You might want to take a look at this." David Patterson had been managing construction projects for 30 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. The moment he saw what Jake had uncovered, he knew they weren't dealing with normal construction debris. The fabric looked like it could be clothing, and the concrete appeared to have been poured deliberately around something. "Shut it down," Patterson ordered. "And nobody touches anything until we figure out what we're dealing with." Within 2 hours, the Cedar Valley Sheriff's Department had cordoned off the construction site. Sheriff Michelle Torres, Tom Branson's successor, stood in the muddy field, staring at what might be the first real evidence in the Bobby Hartwell case in over 4 decades. The concrete block was roughly 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches deep. It had been buried about 6 feet underground, well below the frost line. The fabric emerging from one end appeared to be denim, possibly jeans. A corner of what looked like a leather wallet was visible near the opposite end. "Jesus," whispered Deputy Carlos Vega. "Think it's him." Sheriff Torres had been a rookie patrol officer when Bobby disappeared, fresh out of the academy and eager to solve the world's problems. She remembered the massive search effort, the media attention, and the way the case had haunted the department for years. "We're not making any assumptions," Torres said carefully, "but we're treating this as a potential crime scene until we know otherwise." The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation arrived by late afternoon, bringing ground-penetrating radar, forensic experts, and the kind of equipment the small Cedar Valley department couldn't afford. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, supervised the delicate excavation process. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," Dr. Vasquez observed, as her team carefully removed soil from around the concrete block. This wasn't a panic burial. Someone took time to mix concrete, pour it properly, and dig a precise hole. This was planned. Jake Morrison found himself thinking about his grandfather's obsession with this case. Ray Morrison had died convinced that Bobby Hartwell had been murdered, and that the killer was someone close to the family. Now, standing in the same field where his grandfather had searched for clues decades earlier, Jake wondered if the old detective's intuition had been correct all along. News of the discovery spread through Cedar Valley faster than prairie fire. Sarah Hartwell, now 78, and living in the local assisted care facility, was among the first to be notified. Her daughters Amy and Jessica, now 51 and 47 respectively, drove in from Des Moines and Chicago to be with their mother. "After all these years," Sarah whispered, gripping Jessica's hand as they sat in the sheriff's office, "I always hoped we'd find him, but I never imagined not like this." The concrete block was transported to the state forensics lab in Ankeny, where Dr. Vasquez and her team began the painstaking process of breaking it apart without damaging any evidence inside. Using precise tools and techniques developed for archaeological excavations, they worked for nearly 18 hours straight. The first breakthrough came when they discovered fabric that was clearly from the late 1970s, denim jeans with a specific weave pattern that manufacturers had stopped using in the early 1980s. More importantly, they found a leather belt with a distinctive brass buckle featuring a John Deere logo. "Bobby always wore that belt," Sarah confirmed when Sheriff Torres showed her a photograph. "I gave it to him for his birthday in 1976. He never took it off." But the most significant discovery was yet to come. As Dr. Vasquez's team carefully removed more concrete, they uncovered remarkably well-preserved remains that would finally allow for definitive identification. The preservation was remarkable. The concrete had created an anaerobic environment that prevented normal decomposition. Dental records confirmed what the family already knew in their hearts. These were the remains of Robert "Bobby" Hartwell. But the forensic examination revealed something else that would prove crucial to solving the case. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, a single devastating blow to the left temporal region that would have been immediately fatal. "This wasn't an accident," Dr. Vasquez explained to Sheriff Torres. "Someone struck Mr. Hartwell with considerable force using a heavy, blunt object. Based on the fracture pattern, I'd say it was something like a tire iron or a heavy wrench." The DNA analysis took another 3 weeks, but the results were conclusive. Not only did the remains definitively belong to Bobby Hartwell, but the forensic team had also discovered something else embedded in the concrete: foreign DNA that didn't belong to the victim. Hair samples found pressed against the concrete contained genetic material from someone else, someone who had been present when Bobby's body was disposed of. The DNA was well preserved enough to develop a complete profile, which was immediately entered into the national database. Within 48 hours, they had a match. The DNA belonged to Vincent Torres, a man who had died in a car accident in 1983. But Torres's criminal record told a story that finally began to make sense of Bobby Hartwell's disappearance. Vincent Torres had been arrested multiple times in connection with farm equipment theft. He'd been questioned about the very theft ring that FBI informants had later described to Detective Morrison. And according to his arrest records, Torres had been operating in the Cedar Valley area during the fall of 1978. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, but the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Hidden within the concrete block, pressed against Bobby's wallet, was a handwritten note that would expose the truth about who had really been responsible for Bobby Hartwell's death. Cedar Valley, Iowa, April 2023. The handwritten note found with Bobby Hartwell's remains was dated October 12, 1978, the same day he disappeared. Written in fading blue ink on a piece of ruled paper torn from a spiral notebook, it contained just 4 sentences that would finally solve Cedar Valley's most enduring mystery. I didn't mean for this to happen. Bobby saw what he shouldn't have seen. I panicked and hit him with the tire iron. God forgive me. The handwriting analysis took 3 weeks, but the conclusion was definitive. The note had been written by Earl Kowalski, Bobby's neighbor and closest friend. Sheriff Torres sat across from Earl's son Michael in the department's interview room, watching a 67-year-old man struggle to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his father. "That's impossible," Michael insisted for the 3rd time. Dad helped search for Bobby. He comforted the family. He took care of their farm for years after Bobby disappeared. Why would he do that if he was responsible? The answer came from an unexpected source: Earl Kowalski himself. Earl had died in 2019 at age 85, but he'd left behind a detailed confession locked in a safety deposit box at First National Bank of Cedar Valley. His instructions were specific. The box was only to be opened if Bobby Hartwell's remains were ever found. The bank manager, Janet Ellis, had been holding the sealed envelope for 4 years. Earl's confession, written in 2015 when he was diagnosed with early-stage dementia, filled in the horrific details that the hastily written note from 1978 had left out. On the morning of October 12, 1978, Earl had been smuggling stolen farm equipment through his property as part of a regional theft ring. The operation had been running for months, targeting John Deere tractors and combines from farms across 3 counties. Earl would provide temporary storage for the stolen equipment before it was transported to buyers in Kansas and Missouri. Bobby had returned to his truck earlier than usual that morning and decided to walk the fence line between their properties, something he'd never done before. He'd witnessed Earl and 2 other men loading a stolen combine onto a transport trailer, equipment Bobby recognized from a farm machinery auction he'd attended the previous week. "Bobby was my best friend," Earl wrote in his confession. "When he walked up and asked what was going on, I could see in his eyes that he knew. I begged him to keep quiet, told him I'd cut him in for a share, but Bobby wasn't that kind of man. He said he had to report it, that stealing from other farmers was wrong." The confrontation escalated when one of Earl's accomplices, a man named Vincent Torres from Waterloo, threatened Bobby directly. In the struggle that followed, Earl struck Bobby with a tire iron, intending only to knock him unconscious. The blow was fatal. "I killed my best friend because I was greedy and stupid," Earl's confession continued. "Vincent said we had to make the body disappear completely, or we'd all go to prison. We wrapped Bobby in a tarp and put him in Vincent's truck while we figured out what to do." The cover-up was elaborate and cruel. Earl helped organize the search parties, knowing exactly where Bobby's remains were hidden. He comforted Sarah and her daughters, attended Bobby's memorial service, and maintained the Hartwell farm for years, all while carrying the guilt of what he'd done. "Guys, every day for 45 years, I've lived with this secret," Earl wrote. "I helped Sarah because I owed Bobby that much, but nothing I did could make up for what I took from his family. I'm a coward for not confessing sooner, but I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in my own family's eyes." The concrete burial site had been chosen specifically because Earl knew the area would eventually be developed. Vincent Torres had suggested it, reasoning that construction activity would disturb the soil and potentially destroy any evidence. What they hadn't anticipated was how well the concrete would preserve the remains and the incriminating note Earl had impulsively written in his moment of panic and guilt. DNA testing confirmed what the family already knew in their hearts. The remains were definitely Bobby Hartwell. But the scientific confirmation also provided something else: closure. Sheriff Torres personally delivered the news to Sarah Hartwell, now confined to a wheelchair but still sharp as ever at 78. Sarah listened to the entire explanation without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a framed photo of Bobby on her nightstand. "Earl," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, it was Earl." The revelation devastated the Kowalski family. Michael Kowalski issued a public statement apologizing to the Hartwell family and announced his intention to sell the family farm and donate the proceeds to a scholarship fund in Bobby's name. Vincent Torres, Earl's accomplice, had died in a car accident in 1983, just 5 years after Bobby's murder. The third man involved in the equipment theft ring was never identified in Earl's confession, and likely took his secrets to the grave. On a warm Saturday in May 2023, nearly 45 years after his disappearance, Bobby Hartwell was finally laid to rest in Cedar Valley Cemetery. Over 300 people attended the funeral service, including many who had participated in the original search efforts decades earlier. Sarah Hartwell, supported by her daughters Amy and Jessica, placed a single red rose on Bobby's casket, the same type of rose he'd brought her on their first date in 1963. "Now I can stop waiting for him to come home," Sarah told the gathering. "He's finally at peace, and so am I." Jake Morrison, the young man whose backhoe had uncovered the truth, was among those who attended the service. Afterward, he sought out Sarah to offer his condolences. "I'm glad it was you who found him," Sarah told Jake, patting his hand gently. "Your grandfather would have been proud. He never stopped looking for answers." As the community of Cedar Valley gathered to finally say goodbye to Bobby Hartwell, the case that had defined a generation was officially closed, but the questions it raised about trust, friendship, and the secrets people carry would linger long after the last shovel of dirt covered the grave. In the end, the mystery that had haunted Cedar Valley for nearly half a century was solved not by brilliant detective work or advanced technology, but by one man's guilty conscience and his decision to ensure the truth would eventually come to light. Even if it took 45 years, Bobby Hartwell had come home at last.